Samuel Harg Grove never expected to find human remains when he started digging the foundation for his new barn. It was March of 1891, and the retired railroad worker had recently purchased a plot of land 12 mi outside Austin, Texas. The property came cheap. The previous owner had abandoned it decades earlier, leaving behind nothing but a collapsed shack and overgrown fields that had returned to wilderness. Samuel had fought in the war on the Union side, a fact he didn't advertise in Texas. He'd moved south after mustering out, hoping the warm climate would ease the lung troubles he'd developed during a winter campaign in Virginia. The land seemed perfect, isolated enough for privacy, close enough to town for supplies, and priced well below market value. The first bone surfaced on a Tuesday morning, pale and unmistakable against the dark Texas soil. Samuel stopped digging immediately, his shovel frozen midair. He'd served 3 years in the war, seen enough death at Antietam and Gettysburg to recognize human remains without hesitation. This wasn't recent. The bone was old, weathered, stripped clean by time and earth. He should have stopped, should have marked the spot and contacted authorities. But something made him continue carefully now, using his hands more than the shovel. Within an hour, he'd uncovered 3 more bones. By noon, he'd found evidence of at least 5 bodies, all buried together in what appeared to be a single shallow trench. Samuel worked through the afternoon with mounting dread. The bodies had been buried without coffins, without any apparent ceremony. They were piled atop one another, limbs tangled, skulls positioned at odd angles that spoke of hasty disposal rather than respectful interment. By the time the sun began to set, he'd identified 17 distinct skeletons. The bones told stories to someone who knew how to read them. Samuel had worked briefly as a gravedigger after the war, before the railroad hired him. He could recognize the compression in vertebrae that came from years of heavy labor. He could see the worn joint surfaces that indicated a lifetime of physical work. These were people who'd been worked hard, worked constantly, worked until their bodies degraded under the strain. And they were all wrong somehow. The burial was wrong. The positioning was wrong. But more than that, there was a consistency to the remains that troubled him. In mass graves from the war, bodies accumulated over time. You could see variations in decomposition and how they'd been placed, but these looked as though they'd all been buried at the exact same moment. As though 17 people had died simultaneously and been dumped into a trench together. The local sheriff arrived the following morning, accompanied by the county coroner, a humorless man named Dr. Philip Reeves. They examined the bones with professional detachment, making notes, taking measurements. Samuel watched their faces carefully, looking for any sign of surprise or concern. He saw none. Slave graves, Dr. Reeves announced after an hour of examination, probably from before the war. Not uncommon to find unmarked burials on old plantation properties. Bodies were buried quickly without ceremony, especially during disease outbreaks. "Was there a plantation here?" Samuel asked. The sheriff, a man named Wilson, consulted a small notebook. Property was owned by the Garrett family before the war. Small operation, maybe 40 or 50 slaves. The family left Texas in 1867, sold the land for taxes. It's changed hands 4 times since then. 17 people is a lot to lose to disease, Samuel said carefully. Dr. Reeves shrugged. Cholera could take that many in a week. Smallpox, typhoid, any number of illnesses. The recording for slave deaths was minimal at best. Plantation owners rarely documented such losses unless they were filing insurance claims or estate inventories. And if there are no records, Samuel pressed. Then we do what we can, the sheriff said. We'll have the remains reinterred in the county cemetery. I'll make a note in the official log. Beyond that, he spread his hands in a gesture of finality. These people have been dead for 30 years or more. There's no crime to investigate, no justice to pursue. We give them a decent burial and move on. Samuel wanted to argue but recognized the futility. These were black bodies, enslaved bodies, and to men like Sheriff Wilson and Dr. Reeves, they were historical footnotes at best. The investigation, such as it was, ended before it truly began. The bones were collected in rough wooden boxes and buried in an unmarked section of the county cemetery designated for paupers and unknowns. Samuel attended the brief ceremony. He was the only mourner, A local minister said a few words about Christian charity and eternal rest, and that was the end of it. Samuel built his barn 20 ft west of where he'd found the graves. He tried not to think about what lay beneath his land, but some nights, when the wind moved through the cedar trees, he imagined he could hear whispers. 17 voices calling out names he'd never know, telling stories he'd never hear. He told himself it was just the wind. He told himself it didn't matter. He was wrong about both. 3 years later, in the spring of 1894, a similar discovery was made near Beaumont, Texas, nearly 200 mi southeast of Austin. A cotton plantation that had been subdivided and sold after the war was being developed into residential lots. The new owner, a banker from Galveston named Harold Fitzpatrick, had ambitious plans for the property. He envisioned a neighborhood of modern homes for the city's growing middle class, complete with a central park and ornamental pond. Excavation for the pond began in April. The workers were mostly day laborers, a mix of black and white men, grateful for any employment during an economic downturn. They'd been digging for 3 days when the first skull emerged from the clay-heavy soil. The crew foreman, a man named Cyrus Webb, immediately halted work. Unlike Sheriff Wilson in Austin, Cyrus had no inclination to minimize the discovery. He'd been born enslaved on a plantation in Louisiana, had survived the war and Reconstruction, and had a deep suspicion of any unmarked graves found on former plantation land. Could be murder, he told Harold Fitzpatrick when the banker arrived to inspect the site. Could be disease, could be a lot of things, but this ain't right, and we need to know what happened before we build houses on top of it. Fitzpatrick was less concerned with historical truth than with the delay to his development schedule, but he recognized the potential for scandal if he simply buried the bones and continued. A murder investigation could tie up the property for months, destroy his investment. Better to bring in an expert, get an official determination of natural death, and move forward with a clear conscience and legal protection. He contacted the medical college in Galveston, requesting someone who could examine the remains and provide a professional assessment. They sent Dr. Catherine Brennan. Catherine arrived in Beaumont on April 23, 1894, carrying 2 leather cases filled with measuring instruments, chemical testing equipment, and notebooks. She was 31 years old, one of only a handful of female physicians in Texas, and the only one specializing in medical history and forensic analysis. Her reputation was built on meticulous research and a refusal to accept conventional wisdom without evidence. The medical establishment tolerated her barely because her work was too good to dismiss, and because she focused on historical questions rather than competing for living patients. She made them uncomfortable. This woman who asked difficult questions about bodies that polite society preferred to forget. But she was also useful when someone needed answers that other doctors were unwilling or unable to provide. The excavation site shocked her. By the time she arrived, the workers had uncovered evidence of at least 22 bodies, all buried in a single mass grave approximately 12 ft long and 6 ft wide. The bodies had been laid out in rough rows 3 or 4 deep without coffins or wrapping. There was no evidence of personal effects. No buttons, no jewelry, no fabric remnants that might indicate clothing. Catherine spent 3 days at the site, working from dawn until dark. She documented the position of each skeleton, made detailed sketches, took measurements. She examined bones for signs of trauma, disease, malnutrition. She collected soil samples from various depths, noting changes in composition and color. The skeletons told a consistent story. These were people who'd lived hard lives. The bone modifications characteristic of heavy labor were evident in every adult skeleton. There were men, women, and children ranging in age from infants to the elderly. None showed signs of violent death. No bullet holes in skulls, no blade marks on ribs, no evidence of the trauma that would indicate murder or battlefield casualties. But there was something else. Something that made Catherine's careful scientific mind rebel against the evidence before her eyes. The teeth. Catherine had developed a technique for estimating post-mortem intervals based on dental, where patterns and mineral absorption. Teeth absorbed trace elements from groundwater over time, creating chemical signatures that could be analyzed. The technique was imperfect, but it could provide rough dates, especially when combined with other evidence like burial depth and soil composition. She extracted small enamel samples from 12 different individuals, enough for a statistically meaningful analysis. She sent the samples to a colleague at the medical college in Galveston, a chemist named Dr. Lawrence Miller, who specialized in mineral analysis. She didn't tell him what she was testing or why, just asked for a complete elemental breakdown of each sample. The results arrived 2 weeks later. Dr. Miller's note was brief, interesting samples. The mineral profiles are remarkably consistent, suggesting a very narrow time frame for burial. Based on the mineral saturation levels and soil composition data you provided, I'd estimate these remains were interred approximately 35–40 years ago, likely within a span of 24 to 48 hours. The consistency across all samples is unusual. In most historical burials, even mass graves show more variation. Catherine read the note 3 times, her hands trembling slightly. 35 to 40 years ago would place the burials around 1854 to 1859. And the time frame 24 to 48 hours meant all 22 people had been buried at essentially the same time, not over weeks, not even over days really. Within a period so brief that the earth itself couldn't distinguish between them, she needed more information. She needed to understand what kind of event could kill 22 people simultaneously on a plantation in southeast Texas during the 1850s. Disease was the obvious answer. Cholera, typhoid, yellow fever, all could kill quickly and ruthlessly. But even the most virulent epidemics took time to spread through a population. People didn't all die on the same day. There would be variations, patterns of spread. Some people who survived, this didn't look like disease. This looked like something sudden, something that had struck all at once and then disappeared. Catherine returned to Galveston and began her research in earnest. She needed plantation records from Beaumont for the relevant time period, death records, any documentation that might explain what had happened. What she found was silence. The plantation had been owned by a man named Edgar Sutton, who'd operated a successful cotton enterprise with approximately 60 enslaved workers. Sutton had died in 1866, and his estate had been liquidated to pay war debts. The property records existed, but there were no detailed ledgers, no journals, no personal papers. Either they'd been lost or they'd never been preserved. Catherine expanded her search to county death records. Texas had required the registration of deaths since 1853, though compliance was spotty, especially in rural areas and especially regarding enslaved populations. She found records for Jefferson County, which included Beaumont, but they were frustratingly incomplete. There were scattered entries for slave deaths on the Sutton plantation between 1855 and 1860. Field hand, male, fever, age unknown, or child, female, stillborn. The entries were vague, deliberately so. Plantation owners had little incentive to provide detailed death records for enslaved people. It raised questions about health conditions, working practices, and the value of their remaining human property. She found no entry corresponding to a mass death event. No record of 22 people dying within days of each other. Nothing that would explain the grave she'd excavated in Beaumont. Either the deaths had never been officially reported, or the records had been deliberately destroyed. Catherine was leaning toward the latter. Catherine published a preliminary report of her findings in the Journal of Southern Medical History in October 1894. The article was technical, focused on her forensic methodology and the challenges of estimating burial dates from skeletal remains. She mentioned the Beaumont discovery, but framed it as one example among many of the historical documentation gaps that made researching slave mortality patterns so difficult. She didn't expect the article to generate much response. The journal had a small circulation, mostly medical professionals and academic researchers with specialized interests. So she was surprised when in December 1894, she received a letter from a man named Thomas Gaines in Houston. Thomas was a land surveyor who'd been working throughout eastern Texas for nearly 30 years, mapping property boundaries for legal disputes, railroad development, and commercial transactions. His letter was 8 pages long, written in a cramped but legible hand. Dear Doctor, Brennan, I read your recent article with great interest, as it touches upon something I have observed repeatedly in my professional work, but never fully understood. I am writing to share my observations in hopes they may assist your research. Over the course of my career, I have encountered numerous unmarked burial sites on properties throughout eastern Texas. This is not unusual. The state's history includes many forgotten cemeteries, impromptu battle burials from the Texas Revolution and the Civil War, and informal family plots that were abandoned when properties changed hands. However, I have noted a pattern among a specific subset of these discoveries that has long troubled me. I have personally documented 17 separate sites where enslaved populations appear to have been buried in mass graves without markers or ceremony. The sites share several characteristics. 1, all are located on properties that operated as plantations between 1850 and 18,652. All contain between 15-25 bodies buried without coffins. 3, all show evidence of hasty burial, shallow graves, irregular spacing, minimal excavation. All were deliberately concealed, located in marginal areas of properties, often in disputed territory between property lines or in areas marked as wasteland on period maps. What has always struck me as peculiar is the timing. At 3 of these sites, I was able to measure root growth patterns from trees that had grown through the graves. I am not a scientist, but I understand that tree growth can provide rough chronological data. In all 3 cases, the root patterns suggested the graves dated to approximately the same period, the late 1850s or very early 1860s. I initially dismissed this as coincidence. Many enslaved people died during this period, and plantation owners often buried them with minimal ceremony. But after reading your article, particularly your methodology for dating the Beaumont graves, I began to wonder if there might be a connection. I have enclosed maps showing the locations of all 17 sites I have personally documented. I have also included my original survey notes for each site, which contain whatever details I was able to observe or record at the time. If my observations can be of any use to your research, please do not hesitate to contact me. I am available to provide additional information or to assist in any field examinations you might wish to conduct. Yours respectfully, Thomas Gaines. Catherine spread the enclosed maps across her study floor. 17 sites scattered across a broad swath of eastern Texas. She marked each location with a pin, then added pins for the Beaumont grave and Samuel Harg Grove's discovery near Austin, which she'd learned about through a newspaper clipping a colleague had sent her. 19 sites, approximately 350 to 400 bodies based on rough estimates. She stared at the map for a long time looking for patterns. The sites weren't randomly distributed. They clustered in certain regions, particularly in the northeast corner of the state. Some were separated by only 20 or 30 m, others were more isolated, scattered across central and southeast Texas. She needed more data. She needed to know if there were additional sites, and if so, whether they fit the same pattern. Catherine spent the next 2 months writing letters. She contacted land offices in every county across eastern Texas, requesting information about any discoveries of unmarked graves on former plantation properties. She wrote to county clerks asking about death records from the 1850s. She contacted historical societies, hoping to find local historians who might have documented such discoveries. The responses came slowly. Many counties had no records. Fires, floods, and simple neglect had destroyed their archives. Others reported isolated discoveries that might or might not be relevant. But 6 counties provided information about specific sites that matched the pattern. Mass graves hastily buried, no markers dating to the antebellum period. Catherine added them to her map. 25 sites, 500 or more confirmed dead, all buried the same way, all from approximately the same time period. She wrote to Thomas Gaines asking if he'd be willing to visit some of the newly identified sites with her to verify the pattern and take measurements. He agreed immediately, offering not only his surveying expertise, but also the use of his wagon and equipment. They began their fieldwork in March 1895, starting with the sites Thomas had originally documented. At each location, Catherine conducted the same careful examination she'd performed in Beaumont. documenting positions, examining bones, collecting soil samples, gathering whatever evidence remained after decades of exposure and disturbance. Thomas proved invaluable. His surveyor's precision complemented Catherine's scientific methodology. He could determine exact locations, measure depths and dimensions, identify property boundaries from old maps. Together, they built a comprehensive picture of each site. Not just the graves themselves, but their geographic and historical context. At a site near Tyler, they found something new. The property had been sold to a lumber company in 1889, and the company had kept meticulous records of their land survey. Among those records was a notation from the original survey team. Irregular depression noted in southeast quadrant approximately 40x12E, consistent with field excavation avoided in timber marking. The surveyors had noticed the grave. The ground had settled differently where it had been disturbed, but had simply noted it and moved on. Catherine and Thomas excavated a small test pit at the site. 6 ft down, they found bones. The lumber company granted permission for a full excavation, and over the next week they uncovered 21 skeletons, all buried in the same manner as the others. "This is systematic," Thomas said one evening as they sat by their campfire, reviewing the day's findings. "Someone coordinated this. Multiple plantation owners, all burying their dead the same way, all at the same time, all keeping it quiet. This wasn't random. This was planned." Catherine nodded slowly. "The question is why? What would cause multiple plantations to experience simultaneous mass casualties? And why would the owners conspire to hide it?" "Fear," Thomas suggested. "If word got out that dozens of slaves were dying on multiple plantations, there would be investigations, quarantines, maybe questions about conditions, about diseases spreading. It would hurt property values, might bring federal attention. But what killed them?" Catherine asked. "I've examined hundreds of bones now, no signs of violence. No evidence of epidemic disease patterns. It's as if they all just stopped breathing." Thomas was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "There was a cholera outbreak in New Orleans in 1858. Yellow fever hit Galveston bad in 1859. Could something like that have spread inland?" "Possibly," Catherine admitted, "but disease doesn't work like this. Even the worst epidemics show variation. Some people get sick first, others later. Some survive. This looks simultaneous, and the geographic spread doesn't make sense. These sites are hundreds of miles apart in some cases. How would a disease jump from Tyler to Victoria to Austin? Could there have been multiple outbreaks, different diseases in different places, all happening around the same time? That would be an extraordinary coincidence." They sat in silence, watching the fire burn down to embers. Neither of them said what they were both thinking, that whatever had happened in Texas during the late 1850s, it wasn't any normal catastrophe. Catherine returned to Galveston in April 1895 and immediately immersed herself in archival research. If there had been a coordinated cover-up, there might be evidence in the correspondence between plantation owners, in business records, in legal documents. The Texas State Archives in Austin held the most comprehensive collection of historical records, but they were poorly organized and severely incomplete. Catherine spent weeks wading through boxes of documents, looking for anything from the relevant time period that might mention unusual deaths or health crises. She found frustratingly little. Plantation ledgers occasionally noted deaths, lost field, hand to fever, or child died age 4. But these brief entries revealed nothing about the circumstances. Estate inventories listed enslaved people as property, noting their estimated value, but rarely included information about how or when individuals died. She expanded her search to newspaper archives. The Texas State Library had some newspaper collections, though many had been damaged or lost over the years. Catherine requested every surviving issue from 1857 to 1862 for newspapers published in eastern Texas. Most of the papers focused on political news. The growing tensions between North and South dominated the coverage. Local news items were brief and often trivial. Social events, agricultural reports, advertisements. Deaths were mentioned in obituaries for white residents, but rarely for enslaved people. Catherine read through thousands of pages of deteriorating newsprint, her eyes burning from the poor light and old ink. She found occasional mentions of slave deaths, usually runaways who'd been killed, or individuals who died in accidents that their owners wanted publicly documented for insurance purposes. Then in the December 10th, 1859 edition of the Marshall, Texas Republican, she found something different. The article was small, buried on page 3 between an advertisement for farm equipment and a notice about a lost dog. Several residents of the northern townships report peculiar atmospheric conditions on the night of December 1st. Witnesses describe an unusual quality to the air accompanied by widespread distress among livestock. Mr. James Morrison of the Willow Creek District reported losing 4 head of cattle to sudden illness, with symptoms appearing within hours of exposure to the night air. Others noted agitated behavior in horses and dogs, with several animals refusing to enter barns or low-lying areas. The phenomenon appeared limited to rural areas and had passed by morning. Dr. Samuel Whitfield of Marshall suggests the events may be related to the recent cold spell, which brought unseasonably frigid temperatures and rapid barometric pressure changes. Residents are advised to ensure adequate ventilation in animal shelters and to monitor livestock for signs of respiratory distress. Catherine read the article 3 times, her heart pounding. December 1st, 1859. Peculiar atmospheric conditions, widespread distress among livestock, respiratory distress. This wasn't just a weather report. This was a description of something serious enough to kill cattle and terrify animals. Something that affected a specific geographic area on a specific night. She checked her map. Marshall was in Harrison County in the northeast corner of Texas. Several of her identified burial sites were within 50 mi of Marshall. She searched desperately for follow-up articles. Any additional coverage of this atmospheric event? The next few issues of the Marshall, Texas Republican contain nothing, as if the incident had been reported and then immediately forgotten. She found one more reference in the December 24th, 1859 issue, which included a brief end-of summary of notable local events. The month of December saw unusually severe weather, including the mysterious atmospheric disturbance of December 1st, which affected livestock across the northern townships. Several plantations reported losses, though the full extent remains unclear. Dr. Whitfield continues to study the phenomenon and hopes to publish findings in the new year. Catherine searched for Dr. Whitfield's published findings. She found nothing. Either they were never published or the records had been lost. But now she had a date, December 1st, 1859. She went back through her soil samples and dental analyses, focusing on the ones where the dating had been most precise. Several sites showed burial dates consistent with late 1859 or very early 1860. The Beaumont grave, the Tyler site, and 3 others all fell within that time frame. It was starting to come together. Something had happened on or around December 1st, 1859. Something significant enough to cause multiple deaths across a wide area. Something that affected both animals and people. Something that plantation owners had chosen to hide rather than report. Catherine needed to know more about this atmospheric disturbance. She needed to understand what could cause such symptoms and why it would have been concealed. She also needed to find Dr. Samuel Whitfield's research. If he'd investigated the phenomenon, his notes might contain crucial information. Finding Dr. Whitfield proved easier than expected. Catherine located a brief obituary in an 1883 issue of the Marshall newspaper. Dr. Samuel Whitfield had died at age 72, leaving behind a wife and 3 adult children. The obituary mentioned his long career as a physician in Marshall and his contributions to local medical knowledge. Catherine wrote to Mrs. Whitfield explaining her research and asking if the doctor's papers had been preserved. The response came 6 weeks later. Dear Dr. Brennan, I am pleased to hear of someone interested in my late husband's work. Samuel was a dedicated physician who took detailed notes throughout his career. His medical journals and research papers are still in my possession. I could not bring myself to dispose of them, though my children believe I am simply cluttering the house with old papers. You are welcome to examine Samuel's notes if you believe they may be useful. I would ask that you visit in person, as I am reluctant to trust such irreplaceable documents to the mail. Yours sincerely, Mrs. Elelena Whitfield Catherine, traveled to Marshall in early June 1895. The town was small, quiet, dominated by cotton warehouses and rail depots that served the surrounding agricultural region. Mrs. Whitfield lived in a comfortable house on the edge of town, surrounded by well-tended gardens. She was in her 70s, sharp-eyed and precise in her speech. She welcomed Catherine warmly and led her to her late husband's study, which had been preserved exactly as he'd left it when he died 12 years earlier. Samuel was meticulous about his records. Mrs. Whitfield explained, gesturing to rows of leather-bound journals on floor toseling shelves. He documented every patient, every observation, every theory. He used to say that medicine advanced through careful attention to detail, not through dramatic breakthroughs. I'm particularly interested in his research from December 1859. Catherine said he mentioned investigating an atmospheric disturbance that affected the area. Mrs. Whitfield's expression changed subtly, becoming more guarded. I remember that time. Samuel was disturbed by what he observed. He spent weeks trying to understand what had happened, but he eventually gave up, said some mysteries weren't meant to be solved. Do you know what he found? You should read his notes, Mrs. Whitfield said carefully. His observations were more thorough than his published conclusions suggested. She pulled a specific journal from the shelf marked with a ribbon. December 1859 through March 1860. Samuel's most intensive investigation of his career. He never published the full findings. After you read it, you'll understand why. Catherine accepted the journal with trembling hands. Mrs. Whitfield left her alone in the study with a pot of tea and instructions not to strain her eyes in the dim light. Catherine opened the journal to December 2nd, 1859. Dr. Whitfield's handwriting was precise and methodical. Called to the Morrison farm this morning regarding the death of 4 cattle. Morrison reports the animals were healthy yesterday evening, but were found dead this morning with no apparent cause. Examination reveals signs of asphyxiation, tongues swollen, eyes bloodshot, foam around nostrils, no evidence of poisoning from known substances. Morrison mentions a peculiar smell in the air last night, chemical in nature, which dissipated by morning. Similar reports from 3 neighboring farms. Total livestock losses, 14 cattle, 7 horses, numerous chickens, and smaller animals. All deaths occurred overnight between December 1st and 2nd. All descriptions mention the same chemical odor and respiratory symptoms. I have collected tissue samples from several deceased animals for examination. Initial observations suggest oxygen deprivation, but cause unknown. The geographical distribution of affected farms suggests a localized atmospheric phenomenon, possibly related to the severe cold snap that arrived on December 1st. The entry for December 3rd was longer. Visited 6 farms today, examining more deceased livestock and interviewing witnesses. Consistent pattern emerges. The peculiar smell began around dusk on December 1st, described variously as like burning metal, chemical, and sharp. Wrong. Somehow, the smell intensified after dark and was strongest in low-lying areas and enclosed spaces. Symptoms in surviving animals, respiratory distress, disorientation, refusal to enter barns or other enclosed structures. Some animals that were confined overnight died. Others that were allowed to remain outdoors survived, but showed signs of respiratory irritation. Human symptoms reported by several witnesses. Headaches, burning sensation in nose and throat, dizziness. One elderly woman, Mrs. Patterson, age 68, required medical attention for severe respiratory distress. She reports waking around midnight, unable to breathe properly with a feeling of suffocation. Symptoms eased when she moved to 2nd-floor bedroom. Critical observation. The phenomenon appears to have affected low-lying areas preferentially. Farms in valleys or depressions report more severe casualties than those on elevated ground. This suggests a heavier-than-air gas of some kind, settling into basins and depressions. I have begun inquiring about possible industrial sources, coal burning, chemical spills, etc., but find no plausible explanation. There are no factories or chemical works in this region. Catherine's hands were shaking. She set down her teacup and continued reading. December 4th, disturbing information received today. Richard Mayhew visited my office this morning. ostensibly for treatment of minor ailments, but clearly intending a different conversation. After ensuring privacy, he informed me that his plantation experienced significant losses on the night of December 1st. Not livestock, but enslaved workers. Mayhew was clearly frightened. He reported that 23 people died in their quarters overnight with symptoms matching those I observed in livestock. Respiratory distress, asphyxiation, no apparent cause. He emphasized that this information was confidential and must not become public knowledge. When I pressed for details, he became defensive. Said the matter was being handled appropriately, that the deceased had been buried, and that he would appreciate my discretion. He implied that other plantation owners had suffered similar losses, and that they had agreed collectively to keep the matter quiet. I am deeply troubled by this conversation. If Mayhew is telling the truth, we may be looking at a death toll far exceeding the livestock losses. But why would plantation owners conceal such information? The financial implications alone would seem to demand investigation and documentation for insurance purposes, unless they fear the investigation itself. If authorities determine that the deaths resulted from negligence or unsafe conditions, the legal and financial consequences could be devastating. Better to bury the evidence and claim ignorance. I attempted to ask Mayhew about allowing me to examine the bodies, but he refused. Absolutely said they had been buried already, that there was nothing to be gained by disturbing them. When I suggested that understanding the cause might prevent future incidents, he became angry, said I should focus on treating the living and leave the dead to rest in peace. I left our conversation with the clear understanding that my investigation into the December 1st event should exclude any inquiry into casualties among enslaved populations. Mayhew made it plain that such inquiries would not be welcome and might damage my standing in the community. What am I to do? My medical training and ethical obligations demand that I investigate deaths, seek causes, prevent future tragedies. But I am one doctor in a small town dependent on the patronage of wealthy plantation owners for much of my income. If I push too hard, I risk professional ruin. For now, I will continue investigating the atmospheric phenomenon itself, hoping to understand its cause. Perhaps if I can determine what happened, the knowledge can be put to use, preventing future incidents, even if the specific casualties of December 1st remain officially unacknowledged. Catherine paused, wiping her eyes. Dr. Whitfield had known. He'd understood that people had died, that there had been a cover-up, and he'd been pressured into silence. She continued reading through the journal. Over the following weeks, Dr. Whitfield had conducted extensive research, interviewing witnesses, examining the affected area, consulting scientific literature on atmospheric phenomena and toxic gases. His conclusions, written in a January 1860 entry, were both thorough and cautious. After 2 months of investigation, I can offer only tentative conclusions regarding the events of December 1st, 1859. 1. An atmospheric phenomenon affected an area of approximately 200 square miles in northern Harrison County and adjacent regions. 2. The phenomenon involved the release or formation of a heavier-than-air gas, likely toxic, which settled into low-lying areas. 3. The gas caused respiratory distress and asphyxiation in both animals and humans exposed to sufficient concentrations in enclosed or poorly ventilated spaces. 4. The phenomenon was temporarily limited, lasting approximately 8 to 12 hours, after which the gas dissipated or dispersed. 5. The cause remains unknown. No industrial source can be identified. Natural gas seepage from underground deposits is possible but unconfirmed. 6. The human death toll cannot be accurately determined due to lack of official reporting. Based on indirect evidence and confidential conversations, I estimate between 5,100 fatalities, primarily among enslaved populations, housed in low-lying quarters with poor ventilation. 7. This information will not be published. I have been made to understand that doing so would have severe personal and professional consequences. I record it here for posterity, hoping that someday when the political climate has changed, someone might find this account useful. May God forgive me for choosing professional security over moral courage. That was the last entry related to the December 1st event. The subsequent pages returned to routine medical observations and patient notes, as if Dr. Whitfield had closed the door on his investigation and never looked back. Catherine sat in the quiet study for a long time holding the journal. She'd found her smoking gun. Confirmation that multiple plantation owners had experienced mass casualties and had conspired to conceal them. She had a date, a location, a mechanism, but she also understood Dr. Whitfield's dilemma. Even now, 36 years later, this information was explosive. The descendants of those plantation owners still held power in Texas. Accusations of mass negligent death, of conspiracy to conceal evidence, of valuing property over human life. These weren't historical curiosities. They were scandals that could destroy reputations and fortunes. Mrs. Whitfield appeared in the doorway. "You finished reading?" "Yes," Catherine said quietly. "Thank you for letting me see this." "Will you publish what you've learned?" "I don't know," Catherine admitted. "Your husband was right about the risks. This information could cause significant controversy." Mrs. Whitfield nodded slowly. "Samuel used to say that the truth mattered less than people's comfort with lies. He hated himself for that belief, but he couldn't escape it. I hope you're braver than he was, Dr. Brennan. Those people who died deserve better than to be forgotten because the truth is inconvenient." Catherine returned to Galveston with Dr. Whitfield's journal. Mrs. Whitfield had insisted she borrow it, making her promise to return it eventually. She also returned with a clear picture of what had happened on December 1st, 1859, some kind of toxic gas release. Multiple plantations affected, hundreds of deaths, a coordinated cover-up. But she still didn't understand the source of the gas or why it had been limited to that one night. And she didn't know how to publish this information without destroying her own career and opening herself to legal action from powerful families. She needed more evidence. She needed to expand her investigation beyond Northeast Texas to determine if the pattern extended further. And she needed scientific expertise that she didn't possess. Someone who could explain the mechanism, identify plausible sources for the toxic gas. She needed a geologist. Catherine's search for a geologist led her to Dr. Raymond Foster at the University of Texas in Austin. Raymond was a young professor, only 30 years old, but he'd already published several papers on Texas geology, focusing on underground formations, fault lines, and natural resource deposits. Catherine wrote to him in August 1895, explaining her research in general terms and asking if geological phenomena could explain localized toxic gas releases. His response was immediate and enthusiastic. He found the question fascinating and wanted to know more. They met in Austin in September. Catherine laid out her evidence, the burial sites, the dates, Dr. Whitfield's observations, the newspaper reports. She showed him maps, marking each confirmed grave location and the approximate dates of burial. Raymond studied the maps intently, occasionally pulling out geological survey maps for comparison. After an hour, he looked up with an expression of suppressed excitement. "This is extraordinary," he said. "Look at this." He overlaid Catherine's burial site map with a geological survey showing subsurface formations. "See this line here. This is the Mexiatalco Fault Zone, a major geological structure that runs through eastern Texas. And here, these smaller lines indicate subsidiary faults and fracture zones associated with the main structure." Catherine leaned closer. The burial sites clustered along these lines, following the fault zones like beads on a string. "Now look at this," Raymond continued, pulling out another map showing oil and gas deposits. Eastern Texas has significant underground hydrocarbon deposits, oil, natural gas, various petroleum-related compounds. In most places, these deposits are sealed deep underground by impermeable rock layers. But along fault zones, there can be fractures, fissures that allow gases to migrate toward the surface. "You're suggesting a natural gas release?" Catherine asked. "Not just natural gas," Raymond said. "Natural gas is mostly methane, which is lighter than air. It rises and disperses quickly, but underground reservoirs often contain heavier gases as well. Carbon dioxide, hydrogen sulfide, various sulfur compounds. These are heavier than air and can settle in low-lying areas." He pulled out a chemistry reference book and opened it to a page on hydrogen sulfide. "Hydrogen sulfide is particularly nasty. At low concentrations, it smells like rotten eggs. At higher concentrations, it overwhelms the olfactory nerve. You can't smell it anymore. It causes rapid respiratory paralysis and death. And critically, it's heavier than air, so it settles in valleys and depressions. Catherine felt a chill that matches Dr. Whitfield's observations exactly. A chemical smell heavier than air behavior. Respiratory symptoms. There's more, Raymond said, turning to another page. Carbon dioxide is also heavier than air and deadly in enclosed spaces. It's odorless, which means people wouldn't necessarily smell it, but they'd experience symptoms. Headaches, dizziness, difficulty breathing. In high concentrations, it causes asphyxiation. Could a geological event release enough of these gases to cause mass casualties? Absolutely. Raymond said there's a famous case in Italy, Lake Nyos in Cameroon more recently, though that was in the 1880s after your event. Volcanic lakes can accumulate carbon dioxide from underground sources. And under certain conditions, the gas can be released suddenly in a limnic eruption. At Lake Nyos, the gas cloud killed over 1,000 people in nearby villages. But there's no volcanic lake in Texas. No, but you don't need a lake. You just need an underground gas pocket under pressure and a trigger to release it. Seismic activity can open fissures. Rapid temperature changes can alter underground pressure. Even heavy rainfall can shift geological formations enough to break seals on gas pockets. Raymond pulled out meteorological data he'd requested from the Texas State Weather Bureau. Look at this. Late November and early December 1859 saw unusual weather patterns. A severe cold front moved through the region, dropping temperatures by 40 degrees in less than 24 hours. That kind of rapid change creates significant stress on underground formations. So your theory is that the cold front triggered a gas release from underground pockets along the fault zones. That's my working hypothesis. The rapid temperature change created pressure differentials in underground formations. Gas that had been trapped for potentially thousands of years found pathways to the surface through fault-related fractures. The gas emerged in multiple locations, probably dozens of release points across the affected region. And it would have been heavier than air, so it settled in low areas. Catherine continued, understanding dawning. Slave quarters were typically built in the lowest, least desirable parts of plantations. They would have been directly in the path of any ground-hugging gas cloud. Exactly. People in elevated structures, or people who happened to be outdoors, or in well-ventilated buildings, might have experienced only minor symptoms, or avoided exposure entirely. But people sleeping in low, poorly ventilated quarters would have been exposed to lethal concentrations. How long would the gas persist? Depends on wind conditions and the specific gas composition. Hydrogen sulfide is reactive. It breaks down relatively quickly when exposed to air. Carbon dioxide is more stable, but would eventually disperse through atmospheric mixing. In favorable conditions, a gas cloud could persist for hours, even overnight. But by morning, especially with any wind movement, it would be gone, leaving behind only the dead, Catherine said quietly. And survivors who couldn't explain what happened, and plantation owners who saw only financial disaster and legal liability. They sat in silence for a moment. Then Catherine asked, "Can we prove this?" "Is there any way to confirm that a gas release occurred?" Raymond considered. "Direct evidence would be difficult after so much time. The gases themselves are long gone. But there might be indirect evidence. Mineral deposits associated with gas seepage, alterations in soil chemistry, historical records of similar minor events in the region." "I'd like you to examine the burial sites," Catherine said. "Collect soil samples, look for geological evidence. If we're going to publish this theory, we need more than speculation." Agreed. "When can we start?" "As soon as possible." Over the following year, Catherine and Raymond conducted the most comprehensive field study of its kind. They visited every confirmed burial site, collecting soil samples, documenting geological features, interviewing elderly residents who might remember the period. At each site, Raymond performed detailed geological surveys. He measured the elevation, identified nearby fault features, collected cores from various depths. He was looking for evidence of past gas seepage, chemical signatures in the soil, mineral deposits, alterations in rock structure. The results were suggestive but not conclusive. Several sites showed elevated levels of sulfur compounds in deep soil layers, consistent with past hydrogen sulfide exposure. 2 sites had mineral deposits characteristic of carbon dioxide interaction with limestone, but Raymond cautioned that these findings could have other explanations. The evidence was circumstantial, not definitive. What they did find was a consistent geographic pattern. Every burial site fell within 20 mi of a mapped or inferred fault line. Every site was in a low-lying area relative to the surrounding terrain. And when they plotted the sites on a topographic map, they could trace what might have been the path of a denser than air gas cloud moving down slope from multiple release points. They also found more graves. At every location they visited, they asked local residents if they knew of other unmarked burial sites from the slavery era. Most didn't, but a few remembered stories from their grandparents or had encountered bones while digging wells or building foundations. One elderly farmer near Longview told them about a grave he'd found in 1887 while plowing a field. 22 bodies all piled together. I reported it to the county, but they said it was old slave graves and didn't investigate. I buried them proper in the corner of my land, put up a stone marker. Seemed like the right thing to do. He showed them the marker, a simple granite stone with the inscription "Unknown Souls Found 1887, Rest in Peace." Catherine and Raymond excavated a small test area with the farmer's permission. The bones showed the same characteristics as the other sites. Hasty burial, no coffins, evidence of hard labor during life. They found similar stories across eastern Texas. In town after town, they uncovered accounts of burial discoveries that had been noted, briefly investigated, and then forgotten. Some had been rearied in local cemeteries. Others had simply been covered over again, the locations lost to time. By the end of 1896, Catherine's map included 38 confirmed sites. The estimated death toll exceeded 500 and was likely much higher. Many sites had probably never been discovered, and many discovered sites had never been properly documented. All the confirmed sites dated to late 1859 or very early 1860. All showed evidence of simultaneous burial, all clustered around geological features that could plausibly have released toxic gases. The pattern was undeniable. Something had happened in eastern Texas in December 1859. A natural disaster of terrible scope, affecting hundreds of enslaved people across a wide geographic area, and then deliberately concealed by plantation owners who feared the consequences of public knowledge. Catherine and Raymond prepared a joint paper for publication. Raymond would present the geological evidence and theoretical mechanism. Catherine would document the burial sites and historical evidence. Together, they would argue that the December 1st, 1859 event represented one of the deadliest natural disasters in Texas history. One that had been erased from official records through a combination of racial indifference and deliberate suppression. But before they could publish, Catherine wanted one more piece of evidence. She wanted testimony from survivors. Finding survivors proved more challenging than expected. The events of December 1859 had occurred 37 years earlier. Anyone who'd been old enough to remember clearly would now be in their 50s or older. Many would have died. Others might have scattered after emancipation, leaving Texas for opportunities elsewhere. Catherine began by contacting black churches across eastern Texas. These churches, many founded by formerly enslaved people after the Civil War, sometimes kept oral history records documenting the experiences of their founding members. She wrote to 73 churches, explaining her research and asking if any church records included testimony about unusual deaths during the slavery period, particularly around December 1859. The responses were sparse. Many churches had no such records. Others were reluctant to share sensitive historical information with a white researcher they didn't know. A few responded with brief notes indicating they had some relevant material, but wanted to understand Catherine's intentions better before allowing access. Catherine modified her approach. Instead of asking for records to be sent to her, she offered to visit churches in person, explain her research face-to-face, and work with church leadership to document testimonies in a respectful, appropriate manner. This approach worked better. She received invitations from 9 churches willing to meet with her. The first was the New Hopeim Church in Texarkana. Reverend Marcus Webb, who'd written to Catherine after reading one of her preliminary articles, welcomed her warmly and introduced her to the church's history committee, a group of elderly congregation members who maintained oral traditions and written records. We've been preserving our history since the church was founded in 1866. Reverend Webb explained, many of our founding members experienced slavery firsthand, and they wanted those experiences documented so their children and grandchildren would know what had been endured. He led Catherine to a small room behind the sanctuary where church records were, stored in careful, organized shelves. These ledgers contain testimony from 15 founding members. Several of them describe an incident in December 1859 that matches what you've been researching. Catherine spent 3 days at New Hopeim reading through the ledgers with Reverend Webb's assistance. The testimonies were devastating. Written in plain, unadorned language, they described lives of brutality and deprivation, families torn apart by sale, punishments both casual and calculated. And several described the night of December 1st, 1859. The first testimony was from a woman named Rachel Porter, recorded in March 1868. My name is Rachel Porter. I was born in 1836 on the Vernon plantation outside Texarkana. I lived as a slave until freedom came in 1865. I am recording this testimony so my children will know where I come from and what was done to me and my people. I was 23 years old when the poison night came. We'd been working late. Master Vernon was pushing to finish the cotton harvest before bad weather arrived. The work was hard, and we were exhausted. When we finally returned to our quarters after dark, all we wanted was sleep. The smell started around 8 or 9:00. At first, I thought something was burning, but it wasn't smoke. It was chemical. Wrong somehow, made your nose burn if you breathed deep. My mother said it was swamp gas, but I'd smelled swamp gas before, and this was different. The baby started crying first. They couldn't catch their breath right, kept coughing and gasping. Then the old folks started having trouble. My grandmother said her chest felt tight, like something was sitting on it. I told everyone we should go outside, get away from the smell, but it was cold that night, near freezing, and most people were too tired to move. They just wanted to sleep, said it would pass. The overseer had locked us in for the night anyway. We couldn't have left even if everyone had agreed. Around midnight, people started dying. I don't know how else to say it. They just stopped breathing. I heard them gasping, heard them calling for help, but there was nothing I could do. I tried to help my mother, tried to get her to breathe, but she just stopped. I must have passed out. When I woke, it was dawn and the air was clear and I was surrounded by bodies. My mother, my baby sister Sarah, my grandmother, my cousins James and William, my friend Rose. 38 people dead in our quarters alone. Master Vernon came at sunrise with his sons and 3 white men I didn't know. They didn't check who could still be saved. They just started loading bodies into a wagon, made those of us who survived help. We dragged our own family members, our friends, piled them in that wagon like cordwood. They buried everyone in a field on the edge of the property before noon, made us dig the pit, made us cover them over. One of Vernon's sons said if we ever told anyone about what happened, we'd be whipped until we couldn't walk. Said it was disease that killed them, that it was God's will, and we should keep our mouth shut and be grateful we survived. But I will not keep my mouth shut, not anymore. Those people deserved better than an unmarked grave and enforced silence. They had names, they had lives, they mattered. I want my mother's name remembered, Sarah Porter, aged 48. I want my sister's name remembered, Sarah Porter, the younger, aged 6. I want my grandmother's name remembered, Rose Hamilton, aged 53. I want all their names remembered. Rachel's testimony continued with a complete list of the 38 people who died in the Vernon plantation quarters that night. Catherine copied every name into her notebook, her vision blurring with tears. Below Rachel's testimony were others. Joshua Wright, who'd survived the incident on a different plantation, described similar scenes. The overseer told us later it was my asthma, bad air from the swamps. But I knew that was a lie. I've lived near swamps my whole life. That wasn't swamp air. That was something else. Something poison that came through that one night and killed dozens of us. I heard later from people who came through from other plantations that the same thing happened at the Holloway place, at the Thornon place, at the Mayhew place, all the same night. All the same deaths. The white folks coordinated to keep it quiet, to bury their dead and pretend it never happened. Couldn't have questions about why so many slaves died at once. Bad for business. Another testimony from a woman named Mary Webb provided additional detail. I was 14 years old that night. I survived because I'd been sent to the main house to help with kitchen work, and they had me sleep in the attic storage room. The room had cracks in the walls. I used to hate those cracks because they let in cold air, but those cracks saved my life. The poison air must have dispersed enough by the time it reached the attic that it didn't kill me. I just had a headache and felt sick to my stomach. But when I came down in the morning, 19 people from the quarters were dead. My aunt, my uncle, 3 cousins just gone. The master's wife cried when she saw the bodies. I remember that. She stood in the yard and cried, said it was a tragedy, said she'd pray for their souls. But by afternoon, she was telling the remaining slaves to stop their mourning, get back to work, act like nothing happened. They buried everyone that same day. No ceremony, no words spoken, just a pit in the ground. In Catherine read testimony after testimony, each one adding details to the picture she'd been assembling. The survivors described the same sequence. The chemical smell, the respiratory symptoms, the sudden deaths, the hasty burials, the enforced silence. Several mentioned seeing plantation owners meeting in the days after the event, arguing about how to handle the situation. One survivor, a man named Benjamin Cross, had been working in the main house and overheard a conversation. Master Thornton was meeting with 3 other white men, plantation owners from nearby. They were scared, I could tell, talking about insurance, about investigations, about what would happen if authorities found out. One of them said they needed to coordinate their stories, make sure no one reported the full count of dead. Another said they should spread the survivors around to different plantations, so it wouldn't be obvious how many had died in one place. They were more worried about their money than about the people who died. That's what I remember most clearly. Not grief, not guilt, just fear that they'd lose property value or face legal trouble. Catherine left New Hope with pages of notes and a new understanding of what she was documenting. This wasn't just a natural disaster. It was a story of how human beings had been treated as disposable property, how their deaths had been concealed to protect financial interests, how their very humanity had been erased. She visited 8 more churches over the following months, collecting additional testimonies. Not all churches had records from the December 1859 period, but several did. By the time she finished, she documented testimony from 23 survivors representing 12 different plantations. The death toll these testimonies described exceeded 600 people. And these were only the plantations where survivors had eventually joined churches that kept written records. How many other plantations had experienced casualties that were never documented, never remembered, never acknowledged? Catherine added the survivor testimony to her research, carefully attributing each account, preserving the names of the dead that survivors had fought to remember. The document that emerged was no longer simply a scientific paper. It was a memorial, a historical reckoning, a demand that forgotten lives be recognized. She and Raymond submitted their joint paper to the Journal of Southern Medical History in March 1897. The title was straightforward: Mass Casualty Event Among Enslaved Populations in Eastern Texas, December 1859. Geological and Historical Evidence for Toxic Gas Release. The paper was 38 pages long, including maps, geological data, historical documentation, and survivor testimony. It concluded with a list of names. Every individual whose death could be confirmed or whose name had been preserved in survivor accounts. 347 names, each one a person who'd lived and died and deserved to be remembered. The journal published Catherine and Raymond's paper in its June 1897 issue. The response was immediate and divided. Academic reviewers praised the meticulous research and novel methodology. Catherine's combination of forensic analysis, archival research, and oral history was groundbreaking for the period. Raymond's geological theory provided a plausible mechanism that explained the observed evidence. Several researchers requested permission to cite the work in their own studies of historical disasters and burial practices, but the paper also generated fierce criticism. Descendants of the plantation owners named in survivor testimonies were outraged. Catherine received angry letters accusing her of fabricating evidence to defame respectable families. Several letter writers threatened legal action if she continued to spread malicious lies about their ancestors. One particularly hostile letter came from James Mayhew, grandson of Richard Mayhew, Dr. Brennan. Your recent publication represents a shameful attack on my family's honor based on nothing but hearsay and speculation. My grandfather was a respected businessman and Christian gentleman who treated his property humanely. To suggest that he participated in some conspiracy to conceal mass deaths is both offensive and lealess. I have consulted with attorneys regarding potential legal action. However, I am willing to forgo such action if you publish a retraction and apology in the next issue of the journal. Failing that, you will hear from my lawyers. Catherine showed the letter to Raymond, who was equally disturbed. Are you going to retract? He asked. No, Catherine said firmly. Everything in our paper is documented and sourced. I will not lie to protect people who valued property over human life. They could sue you. Even if they don't win, it could ruin you financially. Let them try. We have Dr. Whitfield's journal. We have survivor testimony. We have the graves themselves. Let them explain in court why their ancestors buried hundreds of people in unmarked graves and never reported it. James Mayhew never followed through on his legal threats. Catherine suspected that his attorneys had advised him that a lawsuit would only draw more attention to the historical record he wanted to suppress. But the controversy had consequences. Several medical journals that had previously published Catherine's work declined her subsequent submissions without explanation. Social invitations dried up. Colleagues who'd been friendly became distant. Raymond faced similar professional backlash. Senior faculty at the University of Texas suggested he should focus on less controversial geological research. His department chair warned that association with politically sensitive topics could harm his chances of tenure. Neither of them backed down. Instead, they expanded their research. Over the next 3 years, they identified 22 additional burial sites, bringing the total to 60 confirmed locations across eastern Texas. The death toll documented in their research exceeded 800 individuals. They also identified 3 other potential gas release events from the same period. Smaller incidents in 1857 and 1861 that had caused livestock deaths and minor human casualties, but had been dismissed as local anomalies. The December 1859 event appeared to have been the largest and most deadly, but it hadn't been unique. Raymond published a follow-up paper in 1899 detailing the geological mechanisms that could produce such releases, including maps of high-risk areas where underground gas pockets might still exist. He recommended monitoring and safety precautions for communities near known fault zones. Catherine published several additional papers documenting burial practices, mortality patterns, and the systematic erasure of slave deaths from official records. She became a controversial figure in Texas academic circles, respected by some, reviled by others, impossible to ignore. In the autumn of 1901, Catherine received a letter that would lead to her most significant discovery. It came from a woman named Virginia Carpenter in Henderson, Texas. Dear Dr. Brennan, I am writing regarding your research into the events of December 1859. My father, Nathaniel Cooper, was enslaved during that period and survived the incident on the Willis plantation. He is now 70 years old and in declining health. He has asked me to contact you because he wishes to share his testimony before he dies. My father has never spoken publicly about his experiences, fearing retribution even after emancipation. But he has followed your research in the newspapers and believes you are someone who will treat his story with respect. If you are willing to visit Henderson, my father would like to speak with you. Catherine traveled to Henderson immediately. She found Virginia Carpenter and her father living in a modest house on the edge of town. Nathaniel Cooper was indeed elderly, his body worn by decades of hard labor, but his mind was sharp and his memory clear. I've been carrying this story for 42 years, he told Catherine as they sat in his small parlor. Figured it was time to let it go before I die. He was 8 years old on the night of December 1st, 1859, living with his mother and grandmother in the slave quarters of the Willis plantation. His account matched the others Catherine had collected. The chemical smell, the respiratory distress, the sudden deaths in the night. But Nathaniel remembered something the other survivors hadn't mentioned or perhaps hadn't known. 2 days after the poison night, he said, Master Willis had visitors. I was working in the yard clearing brush and I could hear them talking in the study. They didn't know I was there. Or maybe they didn't care because I was just a child. They were arguing about money, about insurance claims and whether to report the deaths. One man, I think it was Mr. Holloway from the next county over, said they couldn't report the full numbers because questions would be asked. He said if inspectors came and found that multiple plantations had lost so many slaves on the same night, they'd investigate for disease or poisoning or negligence. Another man, I didn't recognize his voice, said they should blame it on cholera or some other fever. But Master Willis said that wouldn't work because there'd been no illness before the night, no spread afterward. It didn't match disease patterns. Finally, they agreed to stay quiet, bury the dead without markers, and spread word to other affected plantations to do the same. They would share survivors among their properties to distribute the labor loss. And they would tell anyone who asked that some slaves had died of winter fever, enough to explain why they were buying and selling to rebalance their workforce. But not enough to trigger investigation. Nathaniel paused, his hands trembling slightly. I never forgot that conversation, the casual way they discussed it, like the dead were just numbers in a ledger, like the grieving families weren't even human. Did you ever learn what actually caused the deaths? Catherine asked gently. Not for certain, Nathaniel said, but I remember something else. About 3 months before the poison night, there had been a small earthquake. Nothing major, just enough to rattle dishes and scare the horses. And I remember going to the well the next day and noticing the water smelled different, sulfurous, like bad eggs. It cleared up after a week or so, but I remember thinking the earthquake had changed something underground. Catherine leaned forward. An earthquake in September 1859, somewhere around then. I was just 8, so I don't remember exact dates, but it was before the first frost. Maybe late September or early October. Catherine made careful notes. An earthquake would have created exactly the kind of geological stress Raymond had theorized might trigger gas releases. If there had been seismic activity 3 months before the December event, it could have fractured seal formations, created pathways for gas migration, set up the conditions for the later release. Is there anything else you remember? Catherine asked. Nathaniel was quiet for a long moment, then he said, After they buried our dead, Master Willis gathered all the surviving slaves together. He told us what happened was God's will, that it was punishment for sin, and that we should accept it with Christian humility. Then he said if anyone spoke about it outside the plantation, they'd be sold away from their families. His voice hardened. That was the worst part, you understand? Not just that they let us die. Not just that they buried our people without ceremony, but that they threatened us to keep us quiet. They took our dead and then they took our voices. He looked at Catherine with fierce intensity. That's why I wanted to talk to you, because you're giving us back our voices. You're telling the story they tried to bury. You're saying our dead mattered, that their name should be remembered. Catherine had to wipe her eyes before she could respond. Thank you for trusting me with your story, she said quietly. I promise it will be treated with the respect it deserves. I know it will. Nathaniel said, That's why I called you here. That's why I'm telling you this now before I die. Someone needs to know. Someone needs to remember. Catherine spent the rest of the day with Nathaniel recording his testimony in detail. He provided names of the people who died on the Willis plantation, 22 individuals, including his grandmother and 2 cousins. He described the burial site, which matched one of the locations Thomas Gaines had documented years earlier. Before she left, Nathaniel gave her a small wooden box. Inside were 7 smooth stones. After they buried our dead, he explained, I went to the grave at night and left stones. 1 for my grandmother, 1 for each of my cousins, 1 for my mother's best friend, 1 for the baby who died in my mother's arms. I kept these 7 stones to remember them by. I'd like you to have them. Put them somewhere they'll be honored. Catherine accepted the box with trembling hands. I'll make sure they're placed respectfully, she promised. She returned to Galveston and immediately wrote to Raymond about Nathaniel's testimony, particularly the detail about the earthquake. Raymond confirmed that U.S. Geological Survey records documented a magnitude 4.2 earthquake in northeast Texas on September 28, 1859. This is the trigger, Raymond wrote back. The earthquake fractured subsurface formations, creating pathways for gas migration. Over the following weeks, gas accumulated in underground pockets. Then the cold front in early December created pressure changes that forced the gas to the surface through multiple release points. The pieces had finally come together. They had a complete picture. Geological cause, historical documentation, survivor testimony, physical evidence. Catherine and Raymond published a comprehensive monograph in 1902, bringing together all their research from the previous 7 years. The book was titled The Silent Catastrophe: Toxic Gas Release and Mass Mortality in Eastern Texas, 1859. It included detailed geological analysis, maps of all confirmed burial sites, complete reproductions of survivor testimony, and a list of every name they'd been able to document. 412 individuals whose deaths had been confirmed through testimony or physical evidence. The book's dedication read, "To the hundreds of enslaved people who died in the poison night of December 1859, and to the survivors who fought to preserve their memory against deliberate erasure." On the dedication page, Catherine placed 7 small photographs of the stones Nathaniel Cooper had given her. She'd had them photographed and then placed in a memorial garden at a black church in Henderson, where they remained as a permanent marker of the forgotten dead. Catherine Brennan died in 1927 at the age of 64. By then, her research had helped identify 73 burial sites across eastern Texas, documenting the deaths of more than 600 enslaved people in the December 1859 gas release event. Her work had also inspired a new generation of researchers to examine forgotten histories, to seek out the voices that had been deliberately silenced, to treat enslaved people as human beings worthy of historical documentation, rather than as property to be noted in ledgers and forgotten. Raymond Foster continued their research until his death in 1932. He published several papers on natural gas hazards in Texas and advocated for better geological monitoring of populated areas near known fault zones. His work contributed to safety regulations that likely prevented future casualties from similar events. The burial sites Catherine and Raymond documented are still being discovered today. Every few years, someone excavating for construction in eastern Texas uncovers another cluster of bones, buried without markers, without ceremony, without official record. But now, when those discoveries are made, people know where to look for context. They consult Catherine's research. They check church records for survivor testimony. They contact descendant communities and historical societies. The bones are treated with dignity, given proper burial, honored as the human remains they are. And the names, those precious names that survivors fought so hard to preserve, are being remembered. Churches across eastern Texas have created memorials listing the known dead from December 1859. Historical markers have been placed at several burial sites, acknowledging what happened and honoring those who died. The 7 stones Nathaniel Cooper saved for 42 years still rest in the memorial garden in Henderson. Around them, descendants of survivors have placed additional stones, each one representing someone who died in the poison night, someone whose name might be lost, but whose existence is acknowledged. On the first Saturday of December each year, a ceremony is held at the Henderson Memorial Garden. Descendants gather to read the names of the dead, to share stories passed down through generations, to ensure that the silent catastrophe of 1859 is not forgotten again. Because Rachel Porter was right, these people deserved better than unmarked graves and enforced silence. They had names, they had lives, they mattered. And thanks to Catherine Brennan's determination, to Raymond Foster's scientific rigor, and to the courage of survivors like Nathaniel Cooper, who refused to let the truth be buried, they are finally being remembered. The geological evidence confirms it was a natural disaster. A terrible convergence of seismic activity, underground gas deposits, and atmospheric conditions that created a lethal event across hundreds of square miles. The historical evidence confirms it was also a human failure. Plantation owners who valued property over people, who coordinated to conceal mass deaths, who threatened survivors into silence, who erased hundreds of lives from the official record. Both truths matter. Both deserve to be remembered. The unmarked graves of eastern Texas no longer keep all their secrets. When new burial sites are discovered, and they continue to be discovered, even now, more than 160 years after that terrible December night, researchers know what questions to ask. They know to check for geological fault lines. They know to search church archives for testimony. They know to treat the dead with the dignity they were denied in their final moments. They know to remember December 1st, 1859, when more than 600 enslaved people across eastern Texas died gasping for air in the darkness, victims of both natural catastrophe and human cruelty. Until Catherine Brennan decided they deserved better, until their names were finally spoken aloud, until their stories were told. And now those stories live on in academic papers, in church memorials, in historical markers, in the collective memory of communities that refuse to forget. The poison night claimed hundreds of lives, but it could not claim their humanity, their dignity, or their right to be remembered. That victory belongs to the survivors who preserved the names, to the researchers who uncovered the truth, and to every person who has since said, "These lives mattered. These deaths matter." This history matters, and it always will.